Hello, I'm Dr. Aadil Nakhuda, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. I'd like to thank International Institute for Trade and Development to provide an opportunity to present and publish my paper at the Trade and Development Regional Forum 2021. The title of my paper is COVID-19 and Disruption in Supply Chains, Case Study of Asia Pacific Region. First, I will start with the introduction of my study. Several countries in the Asia Pacific region, often referred to as the factory of the world, undertook measures to curtail the spread of the pandemic. As a result, the lack of global trading activity had rippling effects on production and trade flows. Some countries undertook a more stringent response than others, reporting a higher level of workplace closures. These closures disrupted the global supply chains and the flow of goods across borders. The closures not only dampen their own trade flows, but also have an adverse impact on regional and global commerce and trade. The Linear Shipping Connectivity Index measures the maritime connectivity of countries, as some countries are more connected than others. Countries with better connectivity often form an integral part of the global value chains. Hence, higher connectivity index coupled with greater stringency in workplace closure can create large disruptions to global value chains. Now I will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on trade. COVID-19 pandemic resulted in several disruptions to global value chains. This has been discussed in recent literature. Countries adopted different trade interventions to curtail the adverse economic impact within their borders. Trade interventions included various measures such as export restrictions and import liberalization in order to ensure domestic demand is met, particularly of critical goods. Several economies have undertaken RTAs with trade partners to boost trade over the years. RTAs often include provisions to not only reduce the cost of trade, but also to improve facilitation between member countries through better coordination. The non-tariff measures can play an important role to harmonize standards and ensure consumer confidence during a pandemic. Further, it is important to note that countries that remain relatively open in terms of workplace closures may capture export market shares from countries that reported more stringent closures. The export value of products is calculated in which Asia Pacific countries included in the sample have a greater than fair share in exports, or RCA greater than or equal to 1, and countries that have adopted less stringent closures are more competitive in terms of their unit value of exports against countries that have adopted more stringent measures. So data on workplace closures is borrowed from Oxford Coronavirus Government Response Tracker for year 2020. Data on UNCTAD's Linear Shipping Connectivity Index is borrowed from World Bank's World Development Indicators for year 2019. Data on trade flows is borrowed from CEPII's PSEI dataset and United Nations Comtrade dataset. The latest year available for BACI dataset is 2019, while that for Comtrade is 2020. Data on participation levels in global value chains is borrowed from United Nations EASCAP, and data on product groups classified according to global value chains is borrowed from World Bank's World Integrated Trade Solution. Data on trade interventions in 2020 is extracted from Global Trade Alert. Data on non-tariff measures is extracted from UNCTAD's NTM Hub, and data on RTAs is extracted from WTO's RTA database. A two-pronged strategy is adopted to define the participation in global value chains. One uses the United Nations EASCAP Regional Integration and Value Chain Analyzer, REVA, and the other uses the product categories defined according to the reference data available at WITS. The REVA classifies participation in global value chains in the following way. So domestic production in the first exporter that returns via importers' exports back to the exporting country. Domestic production used in importers' exports to a third country. Double counted exports due to repeated border crossings. Foreign production consumed by the importer, or the value added in the exporting country from the use of foreign inputs in production of exports to the importing country. This study does not account for the value of domestic production in terms of final and intermediate goods consumed by the importer, as it only considers value addition in trade that involve multiple border crossings. WITS product classification for global value chains includes intermediate and final goods of apparel, footwear and textile products, vehicles and electronics. This is the list of countries according to the respective statuses. The countries are split at the median level of each indicator. Countries reporting high report index values equal to or greater than the median calculated for each indicator. Now, let me mention some of the literature on the topic. So Baldwin and Tomuria, 2020, Javorcik and Miridot, 2020, discussed the vulnerabilities of global value chains to the pandemic, highlighting the impact on trade. Heutman, Fiorini, and Yildirim, 2020, and Evnet et al., 2021, discuss the trade-related government interventions to alleviate COVID-19 shocks. Certain trade interventions can hurt global trade. Bhatia, 2020, highlights the key areas in the WTO and capacities to address market failures. Ahmad et al., 2021, conduct a survey of Pakistani firms to gauge the impact of COVID-19 on business activities. The analysis and results will be presented in the following sequence. The discussions will involve: 1, evaluating the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chains or value chains. 2, determine the trade patterns associated with the product classifications as discussed above. Number 3, analyze the most frequently used trade interventions on exports and imports in 2020 in response to the pandemic. Number 4, consider the role of RTAs and NTMs in trade from the region. And number 5, evaluate the opportunities for countries with lower levels of workplace closure in participation in global value chains. When evaluating the impact of COVID-19 on global value chains, I studied the total value of trade, both exports and imports, which flows into Asia Pacific countries distributed by the statuses based on the level of workplace closure and LSCI. I expect that countries with higher levels of LSCI to trade more than their less connected counterparts. I present the growth rate of exports and imports between 2019 and 2020. I expect that countries reporting a higher level of workplace closure are likely to experience a fall in the demand of goods, resulting in fall in imports, while countries with lower levels of workplace closure are likely to experience a fall in the demand of their goods, resulting in fall in exports. Here we can see that countries with higher levels of LSCI were trading more than the countries with lower levels of LSCI. Although the fall in exports is more obvious according to the level of closure than the fall in imports, it can be said that countries with lower levels of closure are experiencing a larger decline in exports, while countries with higher levels of closure are experiencing more of a decline in imports. So imports and exports of product categories are classified as defined in World Bank's WITS. Countries with higher levels of LSCI are more likely to participate in global value chains, while trade of electronics is likely to dominate the flow in the Asia Pacific region. Indicators on composition of global value chains are extracted from Asian Development Bank's multi-region input-output tables using WWZ composition with the aid of classifications provided by United Nations ESCAP's REVA. So countries with higher levels of LSCI are more likely to facilitate global value chains involving multiple border crossings of goods. The global value chains within Asia Pacific countries are likely to be the most prominent, with regional countries extracting the largest value addition. Lastly, value addition in electrical equipment is most likely to be driven by foreign inputs, signifying the dependence on global value chains. While countries reporting higher levels of LSCI are most likely to participate in global value chains, the trade of electronic goods, both in terms of final and intermediate goods, is likely to be the most prominent. Foreign production consumed by the importer has an important contribution in terms of value addition based on the components of global value chains. The Asia Pacific countries are more likely to report a higher value of participation in global value chains in dollar terms, which shows the importance of supply chain linkages within the region. The exports of electrical equipment are more likely to consist of inputs from foreign origins across majority of the four statuses. Governments undertook various interventions in order to not only meet the surge in domestic demand of goods as the pandemic hit, but to ensure that production and exports is not severely reduced. Interventions included export bans, export incentives on certain products, and reduction in import tariffs. Critical COVID-19 related goods are more likely subjected to government interventions. With global value chains likely to be disrupted, governments may further liberalize the imports of intermediate goods in order to ensure a continuous supply of inputs. The interventions studied on the import side include the liberalization of import tariffs, import tariff quotas that allow imports below a certain threshold quantity duty-free, while imposing tariffs on the amount exceeding that threshold, and finally, internal taxes on imports. The largest beneficiary of import liberalization was the intermediate goods of electronics. RTAs play an important role to improve trading relationships between countries. RTAs between various trading partners are more likely to be important for global value chains that rely on the supply of goods crossing borders multiple times, such as that of electronic goods. Trade of electronic goods is likely to be more dependent upon RTAs than the trade of textile goods, which includes footwear and apparel. With the prominence of NTMs increasing globally, it is likely that a significant proportion of goods exported from Asia Pacific countries will face NTMs. Although certain NTMs can be trade restrictive, NTMs can play an important role to ensure quality of goods imported as well as harmonization of standards across countries. These measures become ever so increasingly important during a pandemic. A greater proportion of exports of intermediate electronics are the most likely to destinations with which the exporter has negotiated an RTA, while the proportion of exports of final textile goods are likely to be the least. A larger proportion of imports of final products tends to flow into Asia Pacific countries from countries with which they have a RTA. Countries with high levels of LSCI and low levels of closure are more likely to be trading with partners with which they have a RTA. Participation in global value chains involving members with RTAs is slightly high in electrical equipment for exporters reporting higher values of LSCI. The countries in the Asia Pacific region are likely to face high levels of NTMs on their exports. The only group of countries that report low indices for the NTMs are those with high workplace closure, but low levels of LSCI, given that they have a RTA with their trading partner. Their trade is likely to be relatively minimal though. So competition in exports from countries with low levels of closure that continue to produce their goods can threaten the exports from countries with high levels of closure, resulting in the former capturing the share of the latter, given the importers are seeking products produced efficiently and at lower costs of production. Exports of products for which countries with high levels of workplace closure report a fair share of more than 1 or equal to 1, where RCA is greater than or equal to 1, may be threatened by competition from countries reporting not only a fair share of more than 1, but also a relatively favorable unit value of exports. This eliminates products in which the exporters do not have a RCA greater than or equal to 1. The trade-weighted average unit value of exports is calculated for products originating from countries with high levels of closure. How much value is generated in countries with low levels of workplace closure from such products that can compete with products from markets reporting high levels of closure? Right? This is what we will ask, and the result will be in the next slide. Exports of electronics are the most prominent against the set of products that are more likely to capture the export market share from countries with high levels of workplace closure. The trend in exports of intermediate products to countries with the FTA suggests that it is an important instrument to promote global value chains. This has been reported early in the slides. So I conclude my presentation with the following summary. Although the impact of COVID-19 pandemic was widespread across the Asia Pacific region, countries with higher levels of workplace closure and maritime connectivity may report different implications. Countries reporting higher levels of connectivity are likely to report greater levels of trade flows. However, countries with lower levels of workplace closure reported larger fall in exports than countries with higher levels of workplace closure. With different sectors involved in varying rates of global value chain participation, the impact is likely to differ across sectors. Trade of electronic goods are likely to be more exposed to shocks than the trade of textile goods, mainly due to the volume of trade and the higher value of foreign inputs through use of intermediate goods. However, exports of electronic goods also provides significant potential for countries with low levels of closure to capture market share of countries with high levels of closure. Trade of intermediate goods are likely to be more dependent upon RTAs than trade of final goods. The same can be said for trade of electronic goods compared to textile goods. I will end with a set of recommendations. First, I recommend improved trade facilitation and coordination across borders, adopting better practices at the border to ensure goods move through more effectively. Second, priorities are likely to differ across sectors. Trade of electronic goods are likely to dominate global value chains, hence sector-specific measures will be necessary to reduce the disruptions in supply chains. It is crucial that countries considering entering into multilateral arrangements such as WTO's Information Technology Agreement. Third, the production stages of goods traded also matter for multilateral negotiations of RTAs. Imports of intermediate goods of textile products are more dependent on RTAs than the exports of textile products. This will be critical in ensuring the effectiveness of RTAs. Next slide, please. Thank you.